love.
You are there, you are there, you are there, you are there. Where can I go? From your spirit, any place that I choose to go, you're already there. And if I go rise on the wings of dawn, if I settle by the sea, I know your hand is always there to guide me. You are there, you are there, you are there, you are there. Where can I go? From your presence. When trouble is in my way, you're already there. You will not go from my presence. For a word of mine is said, if in the depths I lay my head, in the shadow of your wings, you're there to hide me. You are there, 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 you are there. I've got my faith in the Lord, and it's working in me. I've got my faith in the Lord, and it's showing in me. I've got my faith in the Lord, and it's plain to see. I've got my faith in the Lord. I'm so glad I've got my faith in the Lord. I've got the love of the Lord. I've got the love of the Lord, and it's working in me. I've got the love of the Lord, and it's showing in me. I've got the love of the Lord, and it's plain to see. I've got the love of the Lord. I'm so glad I've got the love of the Lord. I've got the joy of the Lord. I've got the joy of the Lord, and it's working in me. I've got the joy of the Lord, and it's showing in me. I've got the joy of the Lord, and it's plain to see. I've got the joy of the Lord. I'm so glad I've got the joy of the Lord. I've got the joy of the Lord. I've got the joy of the Lord, and it's working in me. I've got the joy of the Lord, and it's showing in me. I've got the joy of the Lord, and it's plain to see. I've got the joy of the Lord. I'm so glad I've got the joy of the Lord. I've got my faith in the Lord. I've got my faith in the Lord, and it's working in me. I've got my faith in the Lord, and it's showing in me. I've got my faith in the Lord, and it's plain to see. I've got my faith in the Lord. I'm so glad I've got my faith in the Lord. I've got the love of the Lord. I've got the love of the Lord, and it's working in me. I've got the love of the Lord, and it's showing in me. I've got the love of the Lord, and it's plain to see. I've got the love of the Lord. I'm so glad I've got the love of the Lord. I've got the joy of the Lord. I've got the joy of the Lord, and it's working in me. I've got the joy of the Lord, and it's showing in me. I've got the joy of the Lord, and it's plain to see. I've got the joy of the Lord. I'm so glad I've got the joy of the Lord. 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 I've got the joy of the joy. on which the Prince of Glory died. My riches gain I count but loss, and pour contempt on all my pride. Forbid it, Lord, that I should boast, save in the death of Christ my God. All the vain things that charm me most, I sacrifice them to His blood.
Hello, welcome to our Bible study. My name is Clint McElroy, and today we'll be in 1 Samuel chapter 28. We will have services today at 10 a.m., so please join us if you can. Masks will be provided at the door for anyone who needs one. If you're sick in any way, please don't come up to the auditorium, but stay at home instead and watch the streaming service. You're welcome to join us at 9 a.m. to watch the Bible study on the large screen in the auditorium. We want to remind you about these English Standard Version Bibles we have from the World Bible School. We're making these available to anyone who needs one. If you'd like to have one, please contact the church office and we'll arrange to get you one. On the COVID watch this week, we know that Bobby Chenault was doing better, but she did have to go back to the hospital for other health complications. Kevin's doing better, as I understand it, but he has been moved to Baylor in Dallas, so continue to pray for him and his family. I'd like to bring to your attention Mike Williamson, who's a CPA here in town. He's been diagnosed with COVID-19. He's had mild symptoms so far, but do pray for him and his family as they deal with that situation as well. No news from my son. He still has mild symptoms. He has started smelling again, so he thinks he may be at the end of the run. My Uncle Billy and Joy have moved out of the home and into an apartment, and during that process, my understanding is they were exposed to COVID-19. So continue to keep them in your prayers as well. As is our custom, we want to call into remembrance the story of the two men on the road to Emmaus who were joined on the way by a third man. When that man left their party, they recognized that while he had been with them, there had been a burning in their hearts. They came to understand that that burning in their hearts was an indication that he was the Christ. It's that burning in their hearts that we want to find in our own hearts. I believe we can achieve that through an understanding of God's Word, drawing ourselves closer to what God would have us to learn from His Word. We also want to remember the admonitions and encouragements from Leviticus chapter 19 to be holy, for the Lord your God is holy. And how can we do that without knowing what holiness is? We go to God's Word to find out what His expectations of holiness in our lives should be. And finally, the story of Rehoboam and Jeroboam is one that's close to my heart. I spend a lot of time talking about the story of Jeroboam and the prophet that came to him, but there is some wisdom in the story of Rehoboam as well. If you'll recall, Rehoboam inherited a kingdom fraught with financial issues. He found himself needing advice, and he went to the older men, his elders, for instruction, for wisdom. And they told him he should consider lowering the tax burden on those people. Instead, he listened to some younger men who advised that he should have a harsh hand with the people and raise their taxes and tell them that they would, in fact, pay more. It's considered that this advice was bad and it was unwise of him to take that advice from them, and that action resulted in the division of the kingdom. And while that is true on the surface, it's my belief that no matter what he had done, the kingdom was going to divide. This was a direction from God. God intended for him to receive this as a punishment for the sins of David and Solomon. But there is merit to the statement, and we should consider that, as always, when we come to dealings in our own lives. Be careful to treat people with kindness and respect and forgiveness. Don't be harsh with them because they may owe you something. Treat them the way you would want to be treated if you owed somebody something. Today we'll be in 1 Samuel chapter 28, which is a very interesting passage. It's fraught with all kinds of little insights into the life, day-to-day life of the people of Israel at that time. I'm a big fan of several of the movies of Steven Spielberg because they're interesting stories, but also because they preserve each and every one of them, it seems, to some degree, some aspect of life from the time in which they were produced or set. To me, that's an incredible thing to look back on movies like E.T. or the original Poltergeist movie and see what day-to-day life was like for people at that time. And remember that that's a very accurate representation of what was going on, the basic background storylines. And that's what I think we find here in some ways in chapter 28. There's lots of little small things that indicate the way people lived at that time, their expectations in life, and we're going to focus on some of those things as we look at the story in 1 Samuel chapter 28. 1 Samuel chapter 28 from the English Standard Version. In those days the Philistines gathered their forces for war to fight against Israel. And Achish said to David, "Understand that you and your men are to go out with me in the army." David said to Achish, "Very well, you shall know what your servant can do." And Achish said to David, "Very well, I will make you my bodyguard for life." Verse 3. Now Samuel had died, and all Israel had mourned for him and buried him in Ramah, his own city. And Saul had put the mediums and the necromancers out of the land. The Philistines assembled and came and encamped at Shunem, and Saul gathered all Israel, and they encamped at Gilboa. Verse 5. When Saul saw the army of the Philistines, he was afraid, and his heart trembled greatly. And when Saul inquired of the Lord did not answer him, either by dreams or by Urim or by prophets. Then Saul said to his servants, "Seek out for me a woman who is a medium, that I may go to her and inquire of her." And his servants said to him, "Behold, there is a medium at Endor." Verse 8. So Saul disguised himself and put on other garments and went, he and 2 men with him. And they came to the woman by night. And he said, "Divine for me by a spirit, and bring up for me whomever I shall name to you." The woman said to him, "Surely you know what Saul has done, how he has cut off the mediums and the necromancers from the land. Why then are you laying a trap for me for my life to bring about my death?" Verse 10. But Saul swore to her by the Lord, "As the Lord lives, no punishment shall come upon you for this thing." Then the woman said, "Whom shall I bring up for you?" He said, "Bring up Samuel for me." When the woman saw Samuel, she cried out with a loud voice. And the woman said to Saul, "Why have you deceived me? You are Saul." The king said to her, "Do not be afraid. What do you see?" And the woman said to Saul, "I see a god coming up out of the earth." He said to her, "What is his appearance?" And she said, "An old man is coming up, and he is wrapped in a robe." And Saul knew that it was Samuel, and he bowed with his face to the ground and paid homage. Verse 15. Then Samuel said to Saul, "Why have you disturbed me by bringing me up?" Saul answered, "I am in great distress, for the Philistines are warring against me, and God has turned away from me, and answers me no more, either by prophets or by dreams. Therefore I have summoned you to tell me what I shall do." And Samuel said, "Why then do you ask me, since the Lord has turned from you and become your enemy? The Lord has done to you as he spoke by me, for the Lord has torn the kingdom out of your hand and given it to your neighbor David, because you did not obey the voice of the Lord, and did not carry out his fierce wrath against Amalek. Therefore the Lord has done this thing to you this day. Moreover, the Lord will give Israel also with you into the hand of the Philistines, and tomorrow you and your sons shall be with me. The Lord will give the army of Israel into the hand of the Philistines. Verse 20. Then Saul fell at once full length on the ground, filled with fear because of the words of Samuel. And there was no strength in him, for he had eaten nothing all day and all night. And the woman came to Saul, and when she saw that he was terrified, she said to him, "Behold, your servant has obeyed you. I have taken my life in my hand, and have listened to what you have said to me. Now therefore you also obey your servant. Let me set a morsel of bread before you, and eat, that you may have strength when you go on your way." Verse 23. He refused and said, "I will not eat." But his servants together with the woman urged him, and he listened to their words. So he arose from the earth and sat on the bed. Verse 24. Now the woman had a fattened calf in the house, and she quickly killed it. And she took flour and kneaded it and baked unleavened bread of it. And she put it before Saul and his servants, and they ate. Then they rose and went away that night. Okay, so last week we read chapters 26 and 27. And they were both stories that were very similar to stories that had occurred in earlier chapters, though they were indeed separate and distinct occurrences. In chapter 26, we see a story that's very similar to the story that occurred in chapters 23 and 24. In this story, Saul is encamped with his army on a hill of Hakilah, and David approaches him and finds him in the camp asleep with the whole army around him. David has brought Abishai with him, and Abishai is asking David, let me kill Saul, let me put my spear through him, and we'll be done. But David defends Saul and says, don't do this, because Saul is the Lord's anointed, and you don't want to do anything against the Lord's anointed. So he takes Saul's spear, which was at his head, and the pitcher of water that was beside his head, and they go up on a nearby hill and call out to the camp and wake them from their sleep. David calls out, kind of mocking Abner, who was the leader of Saul's army and had been asleep right beside, telling him that he was not doing his job and that he ought to be killed because he allowed an enemy of the camp to come in and steal the spear and the pitcher of water from beside his king. At this point, Saul recognizes David's voice, and they have a conversation very similar again to what happened in chapter 24 that results in Saul regretting having come out against David, and each of them going on their way after making a vow not to be anything but a blessing to one another. When we go on to chapter 27, David hasn't taken counsel of Saul's words in chapter 26, but believes that Saul will again come after him. So he thinks the best thing for him to do is to go into the land of the Philistines and make his home there. So he goes to Achish, the king, the place where he had killed Goliath. Goliath was from Gath. And he approaches them with apparently the expectation that they will hear his appeal and allow him to stay with them, which in fact they did. So David makes his home among the Philistines, it says, for a year and 4 months in verse 7. And in that time he would make raids against the peoples round about the Philistines who were enemies of Israel. And when he was asked by Achish where he'd been, he would say that he had been out against Israel or one of their allies. So Achish thought that David was making himself an abomination to Israel and that they would never accept him back. And he was confident that he had control over David as a result because he needed a place to stay. And that's pretty much where we leave off chapter 27. So we move on into chapter 28. And Achish is making preparation to go to war against Israel, and he tells David, hey, I expect you to go up with me and fight with my army against Israel. And David says, sure thing, you're going to see what we can do for you. And Achish is so impressed with David that he says, very well, I'll make you my bodyguard for life. Which is an interesting position to take with someone who has been a mortal enemy at one point. And it's unwise. I don't recommend ever trusting someone who's been your mortal enemy to this degree. No matter what you might think they have done to change, it's best to hold them with some degree of suspicion. Certainly don't make them the caretaker over your very life. But Achish had done that very thing. And then we move on and start talking about the perspective of this attack that Saul had. And again, we revisit the fact that Samuel had died, that Israel had mourned him and buried him in Ramah. During his reign as king, Saul had made sure that he had followed the instructions that he had had from Samuel to put out the mediums and necromancers out of the land, witchcraft. Those who had practiced witchcraft and fortune-telling were put out of the land. So when he saw the threat of the Philistines, it says he was greatly afraid in verse 5, and his heart trembled greatly. So Saul inquired of the Lord, and the Lord did not answer him in verse 6, either by dreams or by Urim or by the prophets. So we have one of our answers. How do these men understand the word of the Lord, understand the instructions from the Lord? So this is the three methods whereby a king like Saul would have understood an instruction from the Lord. He would have understood it either by a dream of revelation to him, or by casting the Urim and Thummim, or by a prophet bringing a message to him. And none of that was occurring for Saul at this time. So he was a little bit panicked, and he told his servants, "Go find me a medium, that I may inquire of her." And they said, "Hey, there's one at Endor." And of course, if you know popular culture in modern America, Endor is the name of the planet that was in the 6th episode of Star Wars, Return of the Jedi. In verse 8, Saul disguises himself and puts on other garments and goes out to this medium at Endor. When he approaches her, he asks that she divine for him a spirit that he may inquire of it. The woman said to him, "Surely you know what Saul has done," not knowing at that moment that he was in fact Saul, "how he has cut off the mediums and the necromancers from the land. Why then are you laying a trap for me for my life to bring about my death?" But Saul swore to her by the Lord, "As the Lord lives, no punishment shall come upon you for this thing," which was not his to do. If he had done the will of the Lord, then what his instruction was to put them out or kill them. And he should have done that in this case as well. It was not his to promise that he would not. The woman said, "Whom shall I bring up for you?" And he said, "Bring up Samuel for me." And apparently the woman immediately saw Samuel and cried out with a loud voice. This is interesting to me too. So we've seen one little aspect of the way people reacted to things in life at this time, and the expectation of understanding a message from the Lord. But here we see that this fortune teller, this medium, was scared to death that she was actually mediating between the dead and this man who'd come to her. She recognized immediately that this was in fact Saul who had asked this of her, and she says, "You have deceived me. You are Saul." And Saul asked her, "Do not be afraid. What do you see?" The woman describes what she saw as a god coming up out of the earth. So this is an interesting thing to me. What would she have had to seen in order to think that it was a god coming up out of the earth? What was her expectation of the appearance of a god? And certainly she had never seen anything like this before, so her practice as a medium was not one that had ever witnessed this kind of thing before, apparently. She described him as an old man coming up, and that he was wrapped in a robe. Saul immediately knew that this was Samuel, and he bowed his face to the ground and paid homage. So Saul still had a great respect for Samuel. And this is a mystery to me, and I think it was a mystery to Samuel to some degree in the way that he reacts to what Saul did. Why would Saul revere Samuel to this extent, but not the God that sent Samuel? Samuel says to Saul, "Why have you disturbed me by bringing me up?" So it apparently was Samuel. Saul answered, "I am in great distress, for the Philistines are warring against me, and God has turned away from me and answers me no more, either by prophets or by dreams." So he lays it out. God's not answering, and I need an answer. I'm scared to death. I don't know what to do. And Samuel responds, "Why then do you ask me, since the Lord has turned from you and become your enemy?" You've got your answer, Saul. God's not answering. So whatever's going to happen is not going to go your way. You have no other option. Verse 17, "The Lord has done to you as he spoke by me, for the Lord has torn the kingdom out of your hand and given it to your neighbor David, because you did not obey the voice of the Lord and did not carry out his fierce wrath against Amalek. Therefore the Lord has done this thing to you this day. Moreover, the Lord will give Israel also with you into the hand of the Philistines, and tomorrow you and your sons will be with me. The Lord will give the army of Israel also into the hand of the Philistines." So he repeats this judgment and makes it very plain to Saul, so he does not mistake what's about to happen. You failed to do what you were supposed to do back with Amalek, and the judgment came down on you, and there's no way out. And not only you, but Israel will suffer because of what you've done. and you and your sons will join me tomorrow." What a terrifying thing to hear, and a terrifying way to hear it, from the very mouth of the man he revered so much, who had promised him so many things from God that were positive that he received, and then this terrible judgment upon him because he did not obey God and his actions against Amalek. Saul took it pretty hard. He falls on the ground filled with fear, and there was no strength in him, for he had not eaten anything. So the woman sees him, apparently back in her right mind, and Samuel was apparently no longer there. She saw that he was terrified and says, "Behold, your servant's done what you've asked. I've taken my life in my hand and have listened to what you have said to me. Therefore, you need to do what I'm telling you to do. Take some food to strengthen you and then go." She wanted him out of there. She didn't want him dying right there on her hands. And I believe there was a legitimate act of mercy here. She saw that he was truly terrified and desperate. He refuses initially, saying, "I will not eat." But his servants there with him, together with the woman, managed to urge him enough to where he listened to their words and he took some food. And then it says in verse 24, the woman took a fatted calf that was in her house and quickly killed it, and took flour and kneaded it and baked unleavened bread of it, and put it before Saul and his servants, and they ate and they rose and went their way that night. That's interesting to me in and of itself. Just a little footnote about the way they lived at that time. I've mentioned this in classes before. The interesting thing about the way the sacrifice of a lamb was prepared to take to the temple later on, and to the tabernacle before the temple. The people were to take that lamb a week before the sacrifice and bring it into their home and keep it there. And I don't know about you, but have you ever seen a video or witnessed anybody with a lamb, even one that's kept in a yard or in a pasture? There's an attachment to that lamb. And the people had this attachment to the lambs that were in their homes. And then they were expected to take that lamb to the tabernacle or temple and have it sacrificed. That's an extremely difficult thing to ask of someone. And here this woman has this calf living in her house. And I'm going to assume she had it there for the purpose of using for food at some point. But nevertheless, it lived there in her home with her. And she killed it quickly and was able to cook from it and make flour and knead it into bread quickly. And I'm anticipating less than an hour she was able to accomplish these things. And she puts it before Saul, who takes of this food and eats it and then rises and leaves. This is interesting to me. It's that little aspect of day-to-day life that is revealed here, and the way that the story's told, that we often just read right over and don't give any consideration to. It's a very interesting thing to me. So it's a very odd story. The Witch of Endor is the way we traditionally referred to it. She was a medium, and when Saul came to her, she did exactly what Saul asked of her, and she saw Samuel come up from the earth and had a conversation through her with Saul. Very interesting indeed, and did not bode well for Saul at all. Nothing that he hoped to hear did he hear. He heard only terrible, terrible news. Certainly there's even more here that we could comment on, but perhaps you found something in what we've talked about that would be beneficial to you. We will have assembly today at 10 a.m. Please join us if you can. Don't come up to the auditorium if you're sick. God bless. Have a great week.